Welcome to a new planetary and seismic update. Last night we had a major earthquake at the Philippines, Mindanao, Philippines, magnitude 7.8, damaging as well. There was even a tsunami warning, and this was actually larger than I anticipated. Yesterday I issued a warning for additional stronger seismic activity. If you look at the previous time frame, on the SGI graph, we see this peak, Mercury, Sun, Neptune, flanked by lunar peaks, and this was on the 6th, 7th, and we actually had an obvious temporal cluster of stronger earthquakes. Here 5.5 in Greece, widely felt, then magnitude 6 the Kuril Islands, 5.6 also widely felt in Bhutan, then a 5.8 in the Easter Island region, and then we had this magnitude 7.8. This geometry on its own could trigger like a mid-6 or high 6 magnitude earthquake. However, we're dealing with a very important sequence of geometry. There was a convergence on the 31st, on the 1st, involving Venus and also Mercury on the 2nd. And you may remember from the previous update that I specifically mentioned the moon in an opposition here with Jupiter, the high green peak here, and that could result in a larger earthquake around the 5th. This is within about 2 days from that lunar peak. However, sometimes what we have specifically with the moon in an alignment with Jupiter is that it can take up to 4.5 days approximately for a larger earthquake to occur. And in this particular case, with the sequence of the geometry, the critical geometry that we had, both involving Mercury and Venus earlier in this time frame, followed by the lunar peak here with Jupiter, and then the final trigger, Mercury, Sun, Neptune. Because Mercury, Sun, Neptune on its own is not a major earthquake trigger. We have to look at the bigger picture here. Also the peak of the convergence here on the 5th, 6th. We see a 5.6 at the Bellany Islands region. So there is a seismic response. However, the actual earthquake, the size also depends on the current stress levels in Earth's crust, and that is something that we cannot measure. So this could have been a 7.8 definitely here on the 5th or 4th, 5th following this lunar peak, because the geometry here was really critical that we had earlier on the 31st of May, the 1st of June. I discussed this in detail in the previous update. We see the seismic response, the temporal cluster of stronger earthquakes, also here on the 3rd, a 5.6 and a 5.7. So we see the seismic response, but when exactly the larger earthquake happens, that is difficult to estimate. First, we look at the next 2 days following the lunar peak, and the 7.8 here, that's difficult to estimate based on this geometry, because 4.5, 5 days is pretty long time. So this is what we had. Also, yesterday, before the earthquake happened, I shared this geometry in social media, and you can see the Mercury with the Sun and with Neptune. That's what happened, and it was flanked by lunar peaks. This is because the moon made geometry 45 degrees, semi-right angle geometry, both with Neptune, Saturn on one side, and then 135 degrees on the other side, most notably here with Venus and with Jupiter. And that can trigger larger seismic activity, but on its own, I would estimate mid to high 6 at most. It's really the sequence that we had throughout that time frame that resulted in this major earthquake. Okay, so let's have a look at the coming time frame. Today we have Mercury, Sun, Saturn. This is also pretty critical. We can easily see a strong earthquake as a result. We look at the lunar geometry that follows on this planetary peak. That is on tomorrow and on the 10th, because then we have the moon in a conjunction with Neptune and also with Saturn. And we also see that Earth will be in alignment with Venus and Jupiter. So we have Mercury, Sun, Saturn and Earth, Venus, Jupiter in a very short time, and this can result in pretty large seismic activity, an obvious seismic response, seismic unrest, especially with these lunar peaks. So around the 10th and 11th there can be a seismic increase. Never underestimate the converging geometry of Mercury and Venus combined. And this is not the only convergence that we're going to have, because if we look at this time frame, first we look at the solar system. I forget that. This is the geometry that I'm talking about. Here is we see the conjunctions with the moon and Neptune and Saturn in a short time. We see Mercury, Sun, Saturn, that's today, and then also Earth, Venus and Jupiter in an alignment. This is a pretty powerful convergence, especially because, again, like I said, Mercury in an alignment with the Sun and Saturn, and also Venus in alignment here with Earth and Jupiter. And then we look at the lunar peaks, and that's with Saturn and with and with Neptune, and as a result we can see an obvious seismic response definitely here on the 10th, 11th. Keep that in mind. Maybe a bit earlier already. So we see another major convergence happening later. This is on around the 13th, 14th, and again we see a converging geometry with Venus and also with Mercury. Here we see Mercury, Sun, Mars in alignment. That is on the 13th, and here we see Venus, Sun, Neptune. That is the most critical geometry in this time frame, or around the 13th, 14th. We also see an overarching dashed lines, red and purple, this overarching geometry from the 12th to the 16th, and that means involvement of Mercury and Venus. We have Mercury, Venus and Uranus as seen from Mercury in a right angle, and that actually happens 2 times. This is very interesting. It happens here on the 12th and again on the 15th, and that means in these 4 days that this right angle geometry of Mercury, Venus and Uranus is basically stationary. Very important geometry, especially because Mercury, Sun, Mars happens in the same time, in the same time frame, and also Venus, Sun, Neptune. And then we have the lunar geometry as well. So let's have a look at the solar system, how that looks. Very critical geometry, powerful convergence around the 13th, 14th. It starts on the 12th. Earth, Moon, Mars in a conjunction. Mercury, Venus, Uranus, right angle here on the 12th and again here on the 15th. Mercury, Sun, Mars in an alignment. Critical geometry. You're definitely going to have a seismic increase here. Keep that in mind. And then we have the lunar geometry with Mercury 45 degrees, Uranus alignment 45 degrees also with Jupiter and with Venus. Basically this is similar geometry to what we had a few days ago. 45 degrees here with Saturn on one side, and then 45 degrees on the other side with Venus and with Jupiter. Again, same right angle geometry spread out on both sides of the moon, and at the same time we have conjunctions here with Mars and with Uranus. Critical lunar geometry at the same time that we have critical planetary geometry. That's Mercury, Sun, Mars, and also Venus, Sun, Neptune. This is really critical convergence, and we can have pretty large seismic activity, definitely in the higher 7 magnitude range, following that geometry. Really critical geometry. So that's what we're going to have. And if we look at when exactly, well, look at the lunar peaks. They are indicative. We have them here on the 12th, 13th, 14th. So I'd say 13th, 14th, that is definitely a time to be on watch for seismic peak. And then we have Venus, Sun, Neptune here on the 15th. That can be followed by large seismic activity. And if we look at the lunar peak, that's with Mercury and Venus, Jupiter here on the 16th, 17th. It's a bit difficult to say when exactly potential larger seismic activity is going to happen. That can be here around the 16th towards the lunar peak. It can also be at the time we're just following that lunar peak. This is a bit difficult to estimate. 16th, 17th, that's about 2 days following Venus, Sun, Neptune. I think that may be a critical time. Okay, so this is what we're going to have in the coming time frame. We already had a large earthquake in the Philippines. Often we see increased seismic activity coming in temporal clusters. That means that it may not be the only large earthquake in the coming days. Check out the website for the latest updates and also our social media channels. Stay safe everyone, and until next time.